I'm really excited for this next conversation. I think it's arguably one of the more important ones that's going to happen on our stage this entire summit. And in part, I think it's one of those ones that's probably collectively going to make us the most uncomfortable. And that's one of the reasons I'm excited about it, one of the reasons I think we need to lean into it. It's titled Decolonizing Together. I want to welcome out my very special guest that's going to guide us through this conversation. Nikki Sanchez is a Puyuma and Irish-Scottish academic, indigenous media maker, and an environmental educator. She has a master's degree in indigenous governance and is presently completing a PhD with a research focus on emerging visual media technology as it relates to indigenous ontology. She recently produced an 8-part documentary series, Viceland series called Rise, which focused on global indigenous resurgence and was released to critical acclaim at the Sundance Film Festival. Can you please join me in making welcome Nikki Sanchez? Welcome, Nikki. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. Hello, everyone.
Nikki, I want to start by just getting us on the same page about what we mean when we use the word decolonization, because I feel like it's a loaded word, and it's a word that I don't necessarily think many of us would know how to define. So what do we mean when we say decolonization?
So as an academic, I find often this language tends to be really exclusionary. And as someone who works as a decolonial educator, when I've been forced to really refine it, at its core, for me, decolonization is the work of collective healing. It is the work of unlearning the harmful and fictitious paradigms of patriarchy, white supremacy, extractionist capitalism that have led to many of the problems we're currently trying to figure our ways out of. And I also just really want to make the distinction between decolonization and indigenization.
Okay.
Decolonization is work for all of us. We are all impacted by colonization, no matter whether we're from Australia or we're here on Treaty 7 territory. It is part of our global story. And so that work is for all of us, no matter how we identify. The work of indigenization, the work of language revitalization, of culture, of ceremony, that is the work of indigenous people.
You touched on it there with the decolonization together, but I wanted to ask you a bit about, this is a big idea. It's also an uncomfortable idea for a lot of people. What do you think that's down to?
I mean, I can speak really truthfully about the current state of reality in our country. We are now looking at over 10,000 unmarked graves of children that were murdered in residential schools. That is not a part of our history. It is a momentary unfolding. There are over 5,000 missing and murdered Indigenous women in this country. Some of them are close friends of mine. This is work that we're steeped in. And so we really need to understand that ultimately, these are not just problems for Indigenous people to face. The majority of them have been caused through settler colonialism. And so that means there's a lot of accountability there to show up so we can collectively find solutions for the future.
You mentioned there that this is work for all of us. You've talked about this idea of decolonizing together. I think sometimes when you read horrific stories like that one that's playing out right now, to your point, you can sit there and go, absolutely agree, traumatic, horrible thing to have done. What does that mean for me, though? What role do I play in that as an individual? There can sometimes be a disconnect between some of what we read in that regard and the personal responsibility that I've got. How would you invite people to rethink their immediate response maybe to some of the conversation or the news events that are playing out at the moment?
Yeah, for sure. I believe with all of my heart that no Canadian is happy about this reality or happy about this history. I believe that all of us, are horrified by understanding the truth of our history as a nation and also the current moment. But opting out, choosing ignorance, is what allowed this to occur in the first place, right? And so one of the things I say in my TED Talk is this history, this colonial history, no one person in the room is responsible for it. It's no individual, culpability, but we have all inherited the outcomes. We've inherited different things. Some of us have inherited privilege, influence, power. And so we are all responsible for the legacy that we've inherited. And we all have capacity in terms of healing those harms and cultivating a future that we can actually feel proud of, excited about, that we feel honored to pass on to the next generation.
You're a decolonization educator. when you go in and you work with groups of people, how do you step them through a process? How do you work through practically the idea of doing better in this regard, quite genuinely? Because I think it's something I resonate with, and I sit here going, I know I want to do better on this. I know I want to be a better ally. I want to be a better advocate. What advice would you give me for how I can do that?
Yeah, certainly. So I think the first one is humility and compassion. I think a lot of us feel really overwhelmed. I know that I have, even as an mixed-race Indigenous person, the more I learned about this colonial history, the more overwhelming it felt. And so I can say, like, 30 years later, I'm still figuring it out. It's a lifetime of work, but certainly there are tangible things that make a massive impact. And the first piece of work is really internal. It's really understanding enough about who you are and where you come from so you can see how you're part of this larger story, how we're all interconnected. Knowing the bundle that you carry, the gifts, maybe you have Scandinavian heritage and there's wisdom, there's recipes, there's matriarchy in your family history, that it constitutes part of the strength that you bring forward and the leadership that you can offer. And then also understanding our own histories allows us to see how at some point or another all of our stories are interconnected. And that really allows us to understand that maybe you're approaching it from over here and I'm approaching it from over here, but ultimately we're committed to the same objective of collective healing of a sustainable future.
I want to ask you, I think, or name something maybe, and again, speaking personally, and I don't know if this resonates for some people in the audience, I think one of the other reasons perhaps that people approach topics like this with trepidation is because they're so afraid of getting it wrong. Like, I'm so afraid of saying the wrong thing, doing the wrong thing, making it worse, I think is one of the stories you can tell yourself about that. Is that a fair concern? Is that something that we need to reframe our thinking around? How would you respond to that?
It's legitimate. Perfectionism is a colonial value. It's steeped into our culture, but ultimately, this guilt paralysis, this fear paralysis, it's not getting us anywhere, right? That complicity is what allowed for 50% of all of those children who were taken away to residential school to die there, you know? So complicity is no longer an option, and it's okay to make mistakes. This is an uncharted territory, and ultimately, we actually need to figure it out together. So tapping into the compassion for yourself, one, that you might not have all the answers, you might make a mistake, and it's okay to acknowledge that. It's okay to ask for questions. As an Indigenous educator, I often travel to different territories to meet nations and languages I've never heard before, and people ask me how I pronounce things in that language. I don't know. I need to ask. It's okay to be learning. It's okay to be a learner. And I think in this space, you know, and a lot of our future-based spaces, we are learners. And showing up with that humility and that permission and that courage is the only way forward.
There's some really interesting parallels, I think, in what Nikki said there to the session we had with Adam Grant earlier. I wanted to, I guess, then pivot us towards the energy conversation, because we are here, obviously, at an energy summit. And I want to ask you, I guess, first, when we talk about this idea of energy transition, it's obviously the banner that we're gathering under over these 3 days. What does that mean to you as an Indigenous woman?
Yeah, I mean, I wish that we had gotten here not at the brink of collapse and chaos. I wish that we'd opted into these alternatives a while ago, but here we are, right? And so I still feel really excited about the potentials. The one law that we can never break is the environmental law. We can outrun it, but ultimately there are finite resources. We cannot live without water, without air, and ultimately we're going to have to face those realities. And so I'm so glad that we've come to a place where so many different genres of research and intelligence and innovation around the world are recognizing that for millennia, Indigenous people have had an acute and in-depth understanding of our ecologies in a way that's allowed us to exist in reciprocity, in abundance, you know, without extracting in a way that is writing our own death certificates. And so I think that this is a time where we need to have these critical conversations, and we don't have a lot of time to do it. And so it's going to force us to get there one way or another.
You talked about Indigenous ecologies there, and I feel like I know the answer, so I don't ask this in a trite way, because I'm actually interested in your nuanced view. To what degree are we tapping into that? When you look at the Canadian landscape right now, how integrated is Indigenous thinking, Indigenous practices, Indigenous ecology into the environmental and energy conversations?
Yeah, it's hugely marginalized. Let's be honest. I think there's been a lot of efforts to sprinkle a little bit of decoration. I think that there's definitely folks who've been included because they're willing to participate in a colonial paradigm. But if we're talking about meaningful paradigm shifts that actually uphold indigenous paradigms of relationality, that's Hishikish Sawak. It's that we are all interconnected. We are all in one way or another in relationship with another. And if we were actually abiding by that, our energy sector would look like the goals that have been set for 2050. You know, we would be doing that a long time ago. And I think we're still also at a really, really exciting time in Canadian history. The reality of the truths that have come forward, of the incredible advocacy that so many Indigenous elders, educators, land-based practitioners have brought forward is finally showing that there are other ways to explore what abundance could look like, what a thriving economy could look like outside of an extractivism that really only benefits a very small portion of our population.
I wanted to ask you there, you mentioned sprinkled a bit of decoration. You said, that people, some who've participated have maybe participated in a colonial paradigm. What does doing participation more meaningfully than that look like? Can you give us any examples or case studies of community organizations, companies that are doing it well?
Certainly, yeah. There's some incredible Indigenous-led protected areas, Hawkman Tribal Park in Clayoquot Sound on the west coast, Deseco Tribal Park. Those are places where Indigenous leadership, elders, knowledge keepers have gone ahead and reasserted sovereignty over their own territories and decided what is land use going to look like, what is intergenerational stewardship and knowledge transmission going to look like, how are we going to plan for a future of a thriving economy outside of capitalism that hasn't been serving us or allowing for this landscape to thrive. And so those are really, really exciting examples. There needs to be many, many more of them. And I'm seeing too, I'm someone who's worked in environmental NGOs for a long time, more and more, scientists are understanding how important that knowledge is to guide innovation into the future. And so those partnerships are being made.
Because I wanted to ask you about that. One of the things you said when we spoke the other day was that the interruption of a lot of traditional practices, in your mind, certainly has really accelerated climate change. Can you just unpack that a little bit?
Certainly, we're here on the prairies, and a keystone species here is the bison. One of the strategies for colonization to force people into assimilation, to force them to sign treaties, was to put a head tax on every carcass of buffalo, and that led to the near extinction of the buffalo, a slaughter of 4 million of them. And Tasha Hubbard, who's a really incredible Cree scholar, is now doing incredible PhD work that showed that extermination of the buffalo here on the prairies led to massive acceleration in climate change impacts. And so if we don't understand how an ecosystem works, when we go in to interfere with it, we're really signing ourselves over to some pretty scary outcomes because we've interfered with a system that we're required to actually also be in harmony with.
Absolutely. So when you look around, where do you see pockets of light? What brings you hope and optimism around a better future and a new pathway in this regard?
Yeah, that is always a really easy answer for me. Biodiversity is, we are at the brink of the iceberg and understanding so much about what our ecologies can teach us about biomimicry, solutions. There's so many mysteries yet to be solved within biodiversity. But beyond that, biodiversity always brings me back to a place of wonder, and I think especially when we're in the middle of navigating through climate change impacts on the West Coast where I live. Last year we had a heat dome that killed over 600 people. It's scary, it can be overwhelming, it can feel defeating. And then I look to the orca whales and the fact that they have more gray matter in their brains than any other mammal on Earth, and the way that they've learned how to transmit distinct language from one pod to another through generation after generation. And I'm consistently filled with inspiration and re-energized.
I love that. I want to use this as an opportunity for learning, as I said, and so I want to lean into, because I think it's easy to say we've got to embrace trying. It's a whole other thing for people to step in and have a go. So I want to help people get a little bit closer. If you're putting your first tentative foot in the water to doing something more meaningful or embracing an idea, Adam talked about a challenge network earlier, that you might think about diversifying the 5 people you spend the time around most professionally, your boards, your organizations, to include a more diverse presence. I want to help us try and land that first step. So if we dangle the toe in the water, we kind of land in a decent place. What is it what do you see people get wrong more often than not? What are the most common pitfalls and traps that do damage that we can all school ourselves up and be really alive to avoiding?
Yeah, for sure. A really big and simple one is language, right? We all went through school at different times. We learned from different people when certain terminology was okay and others weren't. And so often just the way that I speak about resources or Aboriginal, like what certain language that I use is really loaded and is embedded with trauma for a lot of people. And so I think language is a really good place to start, whereas if you have fear that maybe this isn't the right word or you might be saying it wrong, to acknowledge that and ask, I really want to learn more about this, but I don't know the right words. What are some good ways that I could utilize your knowledge to help me learn? And that's a really, really good place to start. And just that humility as well. Nobody on earth knows all things about all things. It is so much easier to have a conversation where you say, Nikki, can you teach me about this? And I can ask you about the
I'm
Australian
learning so much
football
right
league.
now. Let me tell you that much. Absolutely.
And I think that that's a really real place for us to build relationships from. And ultimately, that the work that we need to do, we need to be doing it on equitable grounds. And if we're power hoarding or posturing as though we know things that we don't, it's not a great place to start.
It's the second time in 2 hours we've heard about the importance of humility and humble leadership. Adam was talking about it earlier. Nikki, you're talking about it now. I want to pick up on something Adam introduced us to, this idea of rethinking. Continuing along the same line of thought, what's an assumption, an existing view, a bias we have to rethink urgently?
Yeah, I think that really reevaluating our paradigms of truth that are the basis of settler colonialism, like I mentioned before, patriarchy, white supremacy, expansionist capitalism, those are all fundamental beliefs that I think a lot of people, if they reevaluated, don't feel like they're personally aligned with. But a lot of what we've been programmed into our normal ways of being are embedded on those truths. And so it's an exciting place to recognize that you have all this ability to emancipate yourself from ideologies that aren't your own, that don't align with the values that you hold as a person, and to start to reimagine, like, how can I live my life differently if I'm not committed to perfectionism, if I'm not committed to paternalism, if I'm not committed to individualism? Suddenly, the life and the opportunities that are just there for your own life and the choices that are available to you become a lot more abundant and a lot more exciting.
I'm always mindful this is always part of a bigger, longer conversation. This sort of thing we're talking about here, we hope we're provoking something, an inquisitiveness, a curiosity, an openness amongst people, maybe a connection in for the first time in a way that they haven't felt it before. If that's landing for someone in this room, where do they go? Where do you advise them to go to get more information? Who should they be following? What should they be reading? Other than your documentaries, what should they be viewing? What are some ways that we can expand our reference points to enrich our understanding?
Yeah, I gave a TED Talk for exactly this reason. So it's really designed to be a first step, and there's a lot of those answers.
It is great. I do recommend it.
There's a lot of those answers there. And then there's some really phenomenal Indigenous-led organizations in this country. Indigenous Climate Action is one of them. Melina Labuke-Massimo is an incredible educator, alternative energy. She is the first Indigenous woman to found her own renewable energy company called Sacred Earth Solar. And honestly, if you just, follow the thread of the TED Talk, follow Indigenous Climate Action and Melina Labuke-Massimo, Sacred Earth Solar, it will lead you down a pretty exciting rabbit hole.
Awesome. Appreciate those recommendations. I know you were excited to be a part of this conversation, but you also thought it was really important we were having this conversation at this moment in time. Can you speak a little bit to why now matters so much to you?
For sure. So it's Wednesday today. On Monday, at just a moment's notice, the national government declared Monday a national holiday to grieve the Queen. Millions of dollars have been spent in Canada on behalf of her remembrance, and much more around the world. And simultaneously, we have this incredible and painful uncovering of mass graves that has not been resolved. A lot of Indigenous nations are still having to fund that themselves. We have over 100 First Nations across Canada who don't have access to clean drinking water. And I think, watching how quickly we can shift into a national day of mourning campaign for a figurehead of colonialism who signifies so much harm in this country, but we can't get organized to ensure that our fellow citizens have access to clean drinking water, that the communities who are still trying to bring home their children that were killed at the hands of the states have to self-fund. That reveals to us there's still so much work to be done. And I think we're kind of seeing this, as much as we feel maybe as a Commonwealth country, far away from the classic era of the British monarchy, we can see, in fact, that a lot of the echelons of power are still very much tied to that rhetoric. And I think that's a really exciting time for us to reevaluate as Canadians where we want to put our energy, our resources, and our reverence towards.
It's a great point in terms of just the contemporary here and now, the challenge and the reality of the cultural clash in so many ways of what's going on. How do we go to work at that? What's your advice? We've seen this play out on Monday. It's Wednesday now. Thursday, Friday, tomorrow, the next couple of days. What do you want? What meaning do you want people to make of that? In observing what's happened, what questions or conversations do you hope it sparks?
Yeah, for sure. I would just want to name the 3 realms where you can always pick up this work. The first is at the individual level, having these, doing this work with yourself, kind of clearing out the pieces of, do you know whose land you live on? What happened to them in order for you to occupy that territory? Do you know where your ancestors came from and why they first came to Canada as settlers? The other piece is collective, whether that's within your family or your community, having those conversations, making sure that people have enough information so that they're not recreating forms of systemic racism, forms of extractionism and oppression. And then the other is in your public and your powerful realms, right? What are you brilliant at? Where are your gifts? Where are your privileges? How can you activate those things to be aligned with the values that you hold and the responsibility that you carry to be committed to this greater work of collective healing, which is also known as decolonization?
I really like how practical those kind of areas you divided us into, or suggested we could turn our minds to, were there. The other thing that just struck me when you were providing that answer is maybe one of the other reasons we struggle to see people leaning into some of this. There's a whole range of emotions that come with this, right? But one I just thought of when you were talking then was guilt, and how much of a blocker that is sometimes to being able to lean in. How would you encourage people who feel guilty, who feel a sense of almost, I want to push this under the rug and not have to think about it, deal with it, kind of, for whatever reason we can rationalize and tell ourselves? How do we wrestle with that?
Yeah, I think evaluating your guilt is really important. You can be guilty for something you're actively doing. You can't be guilty for something that happened in the past that you didn't participate in, right? You can acknowledge sorrowfulness, regretfulness, but ultimately, guilt is about your own actions. You can be guilty for your inaction. And if that's something that you're carrying around, then you have the tools to intervene, right? And begin to act. Find those points of action individually, collectively, or publicly in your points of power so that you don't have to carry that guilt. Guilt can be
It can be a motivator
too,
Yeah,
but when we find ourselves in guilt paralysis, that's not what the world needs from us. That's not what is a catalyst for change. And so we need to dig down a little bit and find our grit to move through that and have that be something that can cultivate alternative choices, an alternative way of being that allows us to actually be proud, recognize maybe there were some points of ignorance or points of complicity in the past, but you can turn that around and you can actually build a life, build a legacy, build a community that you feel really proud of.
Julian Tett yesterday talked about these challenges that, what's hiding in plain sight, and this idea that there are a whole bunch of things that we could have seen coming that we didn't, 10 years out. And that came through really strongly, I think, from Olivia and Simon and our panelists this morning around just 10 years from now where we might be able to be. And they were talking about some of the challenges and how we head them off at the pass. I guess more positively, I'd love to ask you where you hope we are in 10 years' time, and what's it going to take to get there?
Yeah, I have to be honest, I look back 10 years from now in the past, and where we've come in 10 years is absolutely phenomenal. The television series that I was a part of, it was one of the first series that was actually created by Indigenous media makers and storytellers Now there's so many I can't even keep up with them. You know, a territory acknowledgement 10 years ago was a radical thing. Now it's ubiquitous. You know, our youth, our languages, our ceremonies, so many things have proliferated in such an incredible way. And I feel profoundly inspired by that and incredibly optimistic, because often these things are exponential, right? So a ripple begets more ripples, and all of a sudden we have these incredible waves of change. And I think that we're in the midst of that right now, not just specific to this conversation, but on so many of the platforms and paradigms that we live within. We're in a time of great transition, and there's many reasons to be really hopeful.
Oh, I love that. That's a great optimistic note to finish on. I should flag in advance too, Nikki's going to be rejoining us a little bit later for our panel conversation, so you can jump in and add questions. We won't come to them yet, obviously, but you can start accumulating those thoughts on what you might love to pick Nikki's brain on. So if this is something, and great benefit, as Roger joked about, anonymous this morning, whether you want to ask it with your name or otherwise, lean into the opportunity to get a little bit uncomfortable and use this as an environment for learning and challenging in order to be able to do better, be better. Nikki, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Padiuch, thank you so much for being here and being part of these really important conversations. These are the kind of conversations that fill me with hope about where we can go together, and how this work of collective healing really is stuff that only you and I and all of us collectively can pick up to make a big impact with. So I'm really grateful. In my language, we say Padiuch Muchi, Padiuch Muchi.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Nikki.